Hey, Jeff, I have this short exercise and I thought we could do the first part of it together.
Sure.
This is something today's guest, T. Marie King, often begins with her presentations. I'm going to name a list of identities and just listen to them. Race, religion or spirituality, age, disability, gender, citizenship, occupation. As you heard those, which ones did you identify with most? The ones that really shaped how you move through the world?
Well, absolutely, loud and clear. And it was age, and I feel that every day now. And when I was younger, I never thought about it, and now it's always there. There's a bit of difficulty in that, but there's also something deeply earned. I'm in my 70s now, and I honestly never thought I'd get here, but I wouldn't trade what I've learned along the way for anything.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate that. And having worked together for years, I also notice how that identity brings you into community with presence, with recognition, a sense of being visible. Now, this is where the exercise gets deeper.
We're going to turn to T. Marie King next, as she invites the group to reflect on a different question.
From that same list, which do you identify with least? The one that you rarely think about, the one that sits furthest from your daily awareness.
So let's give this a listen.
So I did this exercise with some educators. There's about 45 of them in a room. And normally when I do this in person, I have everybody get up and kind of move around the room. And so I said, pick the one that you identify with the least. And everybody, ran to the post of the one that they identified with the least. And I watched this one individual take their time and walk over to disability. Now, there's nothing special about that. But what was interesting was how everybody in the room watched this person, kind of gave this person the side eye. Like, why are they walking over there? And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to save that person for last. So we went around the room, everybody shared. And I got back to that individual and I said, why did you pick disability? And this person said, well, I don't have a disability. Nobody in my family has a disability. I don't think about it, so it's not a part of my life. Nothing is wrong with that answer. I said, understood. Thank you for sharing. I said, but let me ask you something. I said, what do you do in education? And this person said, well, I'm a special education counselor. And I said, okay. I said, well, let me ask you another thing. Is it possible to truly advocate for someone you cannot see? And so later she reached back out months later and said that she really took some time to reflect on that. This piece of the exercise is about who don't we see? Who are we missing in community? Some of us, we don't have to think about citizenship status. That's not in question for us. But there are a lot of people in our community, in our society, that is a serious concern. Some of us don't think about gender. Never crosses our mind because of how we walk through society. It's not an issue. And so thinking about who are we missing? Who am I missing in community that I may not see? And then the last one, choose the identity from this list that you have the most social power. The most social power. And when we start thinking about social power and how we share power, it's about leveraging our relationships, our network, our resources to support and help other communities. I come from a family of ministers, PK kid, preacher's kid. And so for me, a lot of times, one of the biggest issues or challenges we have in the activists and organizing community is finding space to have something, whether it's to host a meeting, whether it's to do an event. Finding space is the most frustrating aspect of doing this work sometimes. And so a lot of times I lean in on the fact that, hey, I know a lot of ministers. And what do ministers have? They got churches, they got spaces. So I'll lean in on that part of my identity and say, hey, remember me? I'm so-and-so's daughter, so-and-so's granddaughter. I'm trying to do this thing for the community. Could we use your multipurpose center? Can we use the sanctuary for this conversation? And so I'll use that and leverage that to get into certain spaces. Sometimes the fact that I'm Black helps in some conversations that I want to be a part of. It's like, oh, well, you don't have representation. You need somebody that can speak to that community. Sometimes I utilize education on certain things. I'm not a big fan of, oh, I got these degrees and this is what I have. But in some circles, it works. It gets you in the door. And so this whole exercise was thinking about how you show up in community, how you're seen, how you see yourself, also who you're missing or who we might be missing in community, but also in the ways that we can share power and open up space and bring other people to the table. How do we use our identity to leverage that?
Hi, I'm Jim.
And I'm Jeff.
What you're hearing today comes from the work of T. Marie King, a facilitator and community leader whose work invites people to look honestly at identity, power, and how we show up for one another.
T. Marie's work is deeply connected to place, especially the cities of Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. These are places that are marked by profound historical racial trauma, by the ways that history continues to shape daily life there.
These are also the places where Zen Peacemakers will gather in April 2026 for the Bearing Witness to Racism in America retreat.
This retreat is not about analyzing racism or trying to fix it from the outside.
It's about allowing the experience of place, of history, of one another to work on us.
As you listen today, we invite you to hear this conversation not just as an interview, but as an invitation to notice what arises for you and how that might shape the way you show up in your own communities.
About letting what we encounter change how we see, how we listen, and how we live.
I've had a very non-traditional path still to today, but it has definitely been enjoyable. And I think reflective of kind of the work I found myself into. I love meeting different folks and just being able to connect with people. So I love having different entry points. The 4 principles that I kind of ground my work in that I do is first, braving discomfort. And I always say braving discomfort because I'm sure you have heard people say, or may have said it, and I'm not going to take your lunch money for saying this, but, this is a safe space, and the fact of the matter is, yeah, until somebody doesn't feel safe anymore. And a lot of times we don't know when that atmosphere has changed for people. Something is said or a comment is made or a look or something, and somebody may no longer feel safe. And so I ask people, brave the discomfort with me. Like, you're going to be uncomfortable. You're probably going to hear something you haven't heard before. You're going to, somebody's going to say something you don't like, but let's brave that discomfort. Let's push through this process together. Next is self-reflection. I don't think we can move the needle on what's going on in our society if we're not doing that introspective work. If we're not taking that time to be self-reflective of not only how we show up in community, but how we operate and interact in community. Are we making sure that we're addressing our own biases? Are we understanding the communities we're trying to work with? Another thing that I think is so important is deep listening. I think taking the time to truly listen to our neighbors, other communities, those who we may be serving, to make sure not only are we showing up correctly, but we're providing or supporting something that the community truly needs. And with that deep listening, that comes empathy and trust. And then lastly, my last principle is proximity and action. I think it's important about getting proximate to communities that have been marginalized and oppressed. And I think that's very vital and important. I think it's also not to just stop with getting proximate. What is the action? What is needed here? And so those are the things that I ground my work in. Again, braving discomfort, self-reflection, deep listening, proximity, and action. I think understanding an issue in a community is just as important as understanding what led us to it. Not blaming communities who are being marginalized or oppressed for the condition they're in, but what led to this? We were recently dealing with this here in Birmingham, where one of our large organizations was, saying these issues are in our community. These folks in this community are not purchasing houses, or they have high levels of diabetes or cholesterol. And I was like, but okay, that may be true, but are we going to talk about the redlining that led to the lack of home buyers? Are we going to talk about predatory lending that impacts these communities? Are we going to talk about the lack of healthy food access? So understanding, how do we get here? And I think that's so important. I think it's also very important to understand how you handle uncomfortable information. How do you show up in conflict? Are you somebody that want to stay in your comfort zone? You kind of operate risk-free, it's safe, you're on cruise control? Are you somebody that is a panic person? You get overwhelmed, the information may be too much, you may get paralyzed by what's being shared. Or do you lean into the growth zone? And if that's not your normal reaction, that's somewhere where I would encourage you to get to lean into the growth zone, to be able to learn a new skill, learn something new, to stretch, to be uncomfortable. There's history that got us here. Understanding these disparities are man-made, knowing how do you respond when you get that new information, not staying in your comfort zone, not panicking, but taking the time to really lean into that growth zone. And then understanding that conflict is normal. We're going to always have conflict. We're going to deal with it, whether it's that normal conflict, your coworker keeps taking your stapler off your desk, normal conflict. If not dealt with, it will grow. And then there's that overt conflict, which you never want to see us get to, but unfortunately we've seen it in society, definitely recently, where the intent is to harm. And so making sure that when we see conflict, whether it's brewing in our communities, whether it's brewing in our own individual relationships or society as well, that we're doing the work to make sure we're addressing those issues so that it doesn't grow and become a bigger thing. I think a lot of times in society, we tend to look at the moment that conflicts erupts into violence to try to understand what happens. When all along we should look at the history and the accumulations of harm and unresolved conflicts that led us there. And the thing that takes the work is when we've seen that eruption is now we got to go back and deal with those issues that led to it. We got to give people the space to not only reflect, but to deal with the hurt that has harmed them. I was working with a group in Selma, and we were addressing some of the issues that took place in Selma, and they were still impacted by the military pulling out of Selma in the 70s because it took away the jobs. So now you have people in Selma still today that work in Birmingham, that work in Montgomery, that drive to Wetumpka in order for work. Now, the problem with that is people say, well, we're not seeing the money come back into the community. Well, yeah, because the taxes are going to those places that they actually work in. And so as we started diving deep into what's the reason why we're not seeing some of the progression you would all like to see in your community, that's when we started getting to some of those harms and those conflicts that happen that may have been state level issues, city level decisions that impacted them. But we were able to say, okay, no, this is where the harm took place. This is what we got to address. And we had folks that were like, yes, let's dig in. And then you had people that was like, I'm not ready to have that conversation yet. I didn't realize I was still upset or as angry, so I'm not ready for that. But being able to track and identify, where did the harm take place? Let's go back and see. And I think a lot of times folks who especially are in the eye of the storm, I would say, find it hard to kind of step out of it to see what actually led us here. I think that's all a part of that first principle I mentioned of braving discomfort, because for us to start working on healing our communities and repairing harm, it's going to be uncomfortable. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's going to be uncomfortable. And it's us as leaders like us, is nurturing other leaders and growing young leaders to be able to brave that discomfort and walk this out. So that's why I think that principle is so important. Next, I think self-reflection. I think we all have to take the time to do the reflective work. We have to turn that mirror on ourselves and say, how are you showing up in community? Why are you going to this community? What is that about? Is it selfishly motivated? Identifying, why am I doing what I do? What baggage am I bringing with me? Looking at yourself truly in a reflective way. People get in their feelings when you mention stuff by prejudice. So I like to use a little smoother word. We all have biases. We all bring our biases to the table, no matter what situation we are in. And a bias is only a prejudice in favor or against something, a person, or a group compared to another. We all have unconscious biases, these things that happen automatically. When they're triggered in our brains, we make these snap judgments. We all have affinity bias, where we may lean to one group over another. I'm going to lean into what I'm familiar with, what I have an affinity to. We just have to make sure that in community, we're not allowing our biases to cause us to make mistakes with people. And that's what we have to be careful of. Being able to examine our biases, look at them fully, identify where those issues or challenges come from, and then be able to properly address it so that we don't make mistakes with people. And we see it happen in society all the time, whether it's Dr. Tamika Cross on a Delta flight, and the flight attendant says, "Hey, we have a sick patient on the plane. Is there a doctor?" And Dr. Tamika Cross, who just so happens to be Black, raises her hand and says, "Well, I'm a doctor. I don't have my credentials on me, but I'm a doctor." And the flight attendant says, "You're not what a doctor looks like." Where does that come from? Or for John Crawford III to be walking around Walmart shopping and somebody deciding you should not be in here, and that leads to his death. And those are very opposite from, "You're not what a doctor looks like," to costing somebody their lives. And making sure that your biases, again, does not lead us to make mistakes with people or to cause somebody the ultimate harm. So we have to do that work. We have to make sure that our biases don't lead to assumptions. All assumptions do is lead us to use of labels and stereotypes. And the only reason people use labels and stereotypes is because it makes us comfortable. It makes us comfortable. It lets us know who we think you are. And a lot of times we're wrong. So you have to ask yourself, does your biases prevent you from being aware of how societal injustices and conflicts impact those you're in community with? And that may be those you teach, that may be those you worship with, those you work with, or those you just live with. Making sure that your biases don't prevent you from seeing how things in community and society impact others. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not okay, I took the weekend and I reflected, and I've gone through all my past trauma and I've done all that, and now I've moved forward. And it's constant, it's ongoing. And I think that's why it's so important to know kind of how we deal with conflict. I've gotten to the point where it's like, I know my pressure points. So I know on certain topics that I'm extremely passionate about, it's like, okay, if I know we're talking about this is how I need to navigate this conversation. It is important because there's things that are so dear to us. And sometimes because we may have been impacted, how I view healthcare may be different from some of my peers, but that's because I've had serious health challenges. So I could easily go 0 to 100 in that conversation, but then it's like, okay, well, let me take a step back. Where's the gap? Where are we missing each other on this topic? The organization I've been working with recently is an urban farm, and we're working with young people around agriculture opportunities. And we have a group at the office that is our equity committee, who were trying to find white supremacy in certain things. And I said, okay, in effort to create this equitable space, are you creating something just because you want something to respond to, or is that actually an issue here? And we had to sit with that for a while for them to finally kind of take the time to reflect. And it's like, oh, actually, this is not an issue with us, but I just feel like everybody should know about white supremacy. And it's like, that's fine. I have no problem with educating people, but let's not create a problem that doesn't exist because you want to change something. What everybody was doing the past 2 years is DEI work. We had everything that happened with, I would say, post George Floyd, we got to have DEI. We need a workshop. Let's get somebody in here to talk about XYZ. And it's like, okay, is your goal to truly address the lack of equity in your organization, or do you want to pacify the people of color in your organization to just make them feel like, well, see, we talked about it, we're good, And so I think people have to be very careful to make sure that we're not creating something, but if we're going to respond to things that happen in society, we're being intentional. I want to talk about deep listening. I think taking the time to truly listen to folks is so key. It's so important. And it makes people feel valued. It makes them feel heard. It makes them feel a part of the conversation, a part of the change, the shifting, whatever may be going on. But also validating that their story is true. A lot of times, because we don't experience every single thing, we may have similar experiences, but we have our own path. Allowing people to have their truth. Just because you're not experiencing it doesn't mean that somebody else is not. I worked with an organization last year where this older white gentleman and this Black lady, probably in her 40s, they had sons around the same age. And, the guy was like, my son is getting ready to drive and, he's so excited about getting a car. So, we're going out looking for cars. And she's like, oh, we are not there yet. I'm not ready to have that conversation. My son already knows we're not doing that yet. And he's like, what are you talking about? They're young. They're 16. It's the time they get a car. Like, no, you got to make sure your son gets a car. She's like, nope, I'm not ready. I'm too afraid. He's like, well, what are you scared of? And she's like, where have you been? And finally, she was like, no, I'm too scared to let my child drive around in a car and know that his skin complexion could cause him not to return home. And this guy who she's been working with for years was like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And she's like, are you understanding what's happening in society? And he literally had a moment of, I never considered that. And so them having to have that dialogue, coming from two totally different places and experiences of, hey, we may be cool, we work together, we got kids the same age, but how your son is walking through the world and how my son is walking through the world is totally different. And him being able to kind of take a step back and like, wow, I didn't realize. But that took him having to slow down and listen, not convince her, oh, it'll be all right, they're young. No, to truly understand what is the root of that fear. And it's not just mom being overprotective. Like, no, we are dealing with societal issues, and we have seen how this has played out numerous times before. I'm scared to send my baby out there. And that takes that time to truly listen. And listening is an action. I think it's also important to understand the role of empathy when it comes to deep listening. Having the capacity to understand what somebody is experiencing or going through from their frame of reference. A lot of times you'll hear people say, if I were you, I would. And it's like, well, you're not coming from that person's frame of reference. They may not even have access to the knowledge you have to even make a different decision, or access to the resources to do something different. So having and exercising and growing that empathy muscle. And then I think also trust is a part of listening. I think a lot of times we do community work or we want to do things that are helpful, and we feel like, well, I'm a trustworthy person. I'm a good person. They should trust me. Well, why? They don't know you. That has to build. That has to grow. That takes time. We have to nurture that. One of the things I tell organizations that get grants and, we're going to go into this community and do X, Y, Z. First thing I say is write into your grant time for trust building. I worked with a community where the folks were like, this big organization came in and they said, we're going to bring you all this and this and this and this. And the community said, we want a grocery store. Okay, we hear you, but we got these art programs for kids. And then we're going to bring this in. And they was like, oh, okay, but we need a grocery store. And after about 4 or 5 years, I remember somebody was like, well, T. Marie, We don't understand why these folks have such a high rate of juvenile diabetes in the community. Like, do these parents just not care about what they feed their children? I was like, they care. I said, but they want a grocery store and they can't get people to work with them to get a grocery store. But you know what they do have? Have a beautiful golden arches. They have all the unhealthy stuff. And now you think mom or dad or grandma or whoever doesn't care because they're subject to what's available. In a community that has very fractured transit. So the closest grocery store is in a community over. And if you're dependent on public transit, I don't know if you've ever carried groceries on a bus, but it is not, it's not a good time. It is not a fun trip. And so getting folks to understand that trust takes time and you have to meet people where they are. So taking the time to build that relationship, build that trust within communities, listening to them, empathizing with them in order to be of service in the community. And it takes time. That's the discomfort, is that it takes time, and a lot of times relationships only move at the speed of trust, so if we don't have that trust with communities, we have to build it. And that takes time. And sometimes that slows down maybe what we want to do personally. But I promise you, you'll be the better for it if you take the time to build. And then lastly, proximity and action. What does that mean? Getting proximate, getting close. What does that look like? I think it's also important when you're getting close to communities to find out and do your research on who was there before you. I think a lot of times we go into communities and we have these great ideas and we are met with resistance. And it's not necessarily always us or with the new idea. Could they have been harmed before? And I think that's vital information for whatever you're trying to do with a new community. Who was here before? Did somebody else try to do something similar? What happened? Did they run out ahead of the community? Who are those staples in the community? That could be that coach that's been coaching the middle school football team or the summer football league for 30, 40 years. They know everybody's business. They know everything. That may be Miss Johnson, who's been living in the community for years, or is the neighborhood president. That could be a local pastor who people trust and they talk to. Finding those folks who can give you that information, but who can also leverage their relationship in the community to bring you in to have those larger conversations. So as we get proximate, as we get close to these communities, making sure we find out who was there before us, if anything, any harm was done that we need to be aware of, so that as we're coming in the right way. We want to make sure that we're including people in change, in shift, in community conversations about things that impact them. I believe that those who are closest to the problem are the closest to the solution. They know what they need for their situation to change. It's not always this big thing out in the sky. A lot of times it's something extremely simple. If this barrier was removed, I could actually do X, Y, and Z. So getting close to those folks, making sure they're part of the conversations, making sure we're creating equity by lending space. And then lastly, equity. Equity is action oriented, and it has to start top down. I believe everything rises and falls with leadership. Equity is about the proper treatment and the elimination of disparities, providing everybody in the community with ownership, agency, and control. It means us working towards outcomes in ways that model dignity, that model justice, that model love. And I think that's where we have to get back to. I really feel like us getting back to that place of truly loving our neighbor. And if we really follow that scripture all the way out, as we love ourselves, and if we really love ourselves that much, can we do that work and make sure that we're extending that same love and compassion and empathy to our neighbors? It's going to stretch us sometimes to expand our relationships. Who's missing from your circle? If you look, does everybody in your circle think, believe, and look like you. And if they do, you might want to expand. You might want to bring in some different folks. So how do we do that? We got to brave that discomfort. We got to get places where we're not always comfortable. We got to do the self-reflective work. We got to take the time to look at ourselves and say, hey, what baggage are you bringing? What blind spots do you have? Do you have biases that may cause you to make mistakes with people? Let's deal with that. Let me address that. Taking the time to listen deeply to folks. Building that empathy muscle. Taking time for trust to grow and relationships to grow. And then getting proximate to the people who you want to help, you want to support, you want to serve, you want to stand in allyship with. But don't stop there. Commit to action.
As we come to a close, we want to thank you for spending this time with us.
And also for being willing to sit with an exercise and a conversation that asks us to look a little more closely at ourselves and at our communities.
If today's episode resonates with you, we invite you to learn more about Zen Peacemakers Bearing Witness to Racism in America retreat, taking place in Selma and Montgomery, Alabama.
This retreat isn't about changing the world directly. It's about allowing the experience to change us and then seeing what kind of action becomes possible from there.
You can also join T. Marie King for a free online event with the Zen Peacemakers called Perspective and Empathy, Learning Beyond Our Own Lens. Both the retreat information and details about this online event can be found in the description of this show.
And if you find value in these conversations, we invite you to subscribe to the Peacemakers Podcast and help support the work of Zen Peacemakers.
You can learn more about membership and ways to support this work at www.zenpeacemakers.org.
Thanks again for listening.
We'll be back with our next episode in 2 weeks.
The Peacemakers Podcast is a production of Zen Peacemakers, an international organization whose mission is to realize our oneness and relieve suffering through contemplative social action. You can find the full video recording of this podcast and more at www.zenpeacemakers.org and go to our media library.